Peter Jaga, the multi-billionaire oil magnate, stood beside his sleek black car parked in the driveway of his sprawling mansion. The estate was immaculate, with high walls and gardens trimmed to perfection. The long, winding driveway stretched like a path to another world, one where power and wealth were king. Behind him, the mansion loomed large, its grand exterior a testament to his achievements. 2 suitcases had already been arranged neatly by the chauffeur. Peter glanced at his watch, the gold face glinting under the fading sunlight. His face was calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a sign of the endless business deals and pressures weighing on him. At the front entrance, Victoria, his wife, stood poised against the marble doorway. She wore a flowing cream dress that clung to her slender figure, her blonde hair cascading over one shoulder. She had perfected the art of looking like a devoted wife, but tonight, something in her demeanor felt rehearsed. "Back in a week," Peter said as he stepped toward her. His deep, commanding voice cut through the stillness. Victoria smiled, her lips curving in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Peter leaned in to kiss her cheek, his cologne enveloping her for a brief moment. "I'll hold down the fort," she said lightly, brushing a hand against his arm. Her voice carried the warmth of familiarity, but there was a faint edge to it, a coolness beneath the surface. Peter pulled back, giving her a searching glance before nodding. He turned to the chauffeur and motioned for him to load the last bag. Victoria watched him go, her smile fixed in place like a mask. When Peter slid into the back seat of the car, he lowered the window and said, "Make sure the kids behave. I'll call tomorrow." "I always do," Victoria replied, her tone even, smooth as glass. The car eased down the driveway, its tires crunching softly against the gravel. The gates opened, and the sleek vehicle disappeared into the distance, its red tail lights glowing like embers against the darkening sky. As soon as the gates shut behind the car, Victoria's smile faded. Her posture shifted, her shoulders relaxing as she let out a small breath. She turned and stepped back inside the mansion, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the vast, empty space. From a shadowed corner near the kitchen, Grace stood frozen. She clutched the edge of her apron, her knuckles white as she watched Victoria disappear into the sitting room. Grace's heart thudded in her chest. She had seen Victoria's expression change, had caught the subtle shift from the perfect wife to something colder, sharper. This wasn't the first time Grace had noticed it. For weeks, she had watched Victoria. The hurried phone calls, the strange cars parked just beyond the estate's gates, the way she smiled when Peter wasn't looking, it all painted a picture that Grace didn't fully understand, but it unsettled her deeply. Grace was just a maid, a girl from the village who had been given a chance to work in a home that seemed like a palace. She knew her place. She cleaned, she cooked, she served the family, and she kept quiet. But tonight, her instincts told her something was wrong. Her hands trembled as she picked up the broom she'd been using earlier. She told herself to ignore it, to finish her work and retreat to her quarters like always. But then she heard it, Victoria's voice, low and urgent, coming from the sitting room. "He's gone," Victoria said. There was a pause, followed by a faint chuckle. "Yes. Tonight. Come now." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her grip tightened on the broomstick as she took a small step closer to the doorway, careful to stay hidden. Victoria stood near the large sitting room window, her phone pressed to her ear. She was pacing slightly, her bare feet moving soundlessly across the plush rug. "No, it'll be fine," Victoria continued. "The staff don't matter. She's just a maid. She doesn't know anything." Grace's heart sank. She didn't need to know the details to understand that whoever Victoria was speaking to had no good intentions. And then Victoria said something that made Grace's blood run cold. "By this time next week, everything he owns will be ours." Grace felt like the air had been knocked out of her. Her hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the broom. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. For a moment, the world felt impossibly small. The grand mansion, the endless halls, the towering ceilings, all of it seemed to close in on her as she processed what she'd just heard. She's planning something against Mr. Peter. Grace didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to stop it. But one thing was clear, Victoria wasn't the woman Peter thought she was. Later that night, Grace lay awake in her small room, her mind racing. The thin walls of the staff quarters offered little comfort, and the cold air seeped in through the tiny window above her bed. She clutched her blanket tightly, her heart heavy with dread. She thought of Peter, the man who had treated her with kindness, who had given her a chance to escape the poverty of her village. He didn't deserve this. But how could she warn him? How could she stop him from falling into their trap? Grace knew she had no power here. She was a nobody, a girl who scrubbed floors and washed dishes. If she tried to speak up, who would believe her? Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she stared at the ceiling. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. In the silence of the night, Grace made a decision. She wouldn't let Victoria get away with this. No matter what it cost her. The mansion was quiet, but Grace's mind was loud. Lying in her small, cold room, she stared at the faint outline of the ceiling, her heart racing as though it might break free from her chest. The weight of what she had overheard earlier pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Victoria's words rang in her ears, "By this time next week, everything he owns will be ours." What did she mean by that? Grace had spent the past hour replaying the events in her mind. She had wanted to burst into Peter's office, grab the phone, and warn him right away. But he was already miles away, on a plane headed overseas. She had no way to contact him directly. And then there was the other problem, Victoria. Grace knew that if Victoria even suspected she had overheard her conversation, it would be over for her. The woman was sharp, calculating, and powerful. She could have Grace dismissed with a single phone call. Worse, Victoria had made it abundantly clear in the past that she saw Grace as nothing more than an insignificant servant, someone who could be discarded at any moment. Grace hugged her knees to her chest, her breath coming out in shaky bursts. She hated feeling helpless, but in a house like this, it was a feeling she knew all too well. The soft creak of a floorboard jolted her upright. Her head snapped toward the door, and her entire body froze. Someone was moving in the hallway. The sound was faint but deliberate, the slow, careful steps of someone trying not to be heard. Grace slipped off her bed, her bare feet touching the cold tiled floor. She tiptoed to the door, her heart pounding as she pressed her ear against it. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the walls. It was coming from the direction of the sitting room. Grace hesitated, fear clawing at her throat. Every instinct told her to stay put, to lock the door and pretend she had heard nothing. But curiosity and dread pushed her forward. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening out there, it wasn't innocent. With trembling hands, she turned the doorknob and stepped out into the hallway. The air felt cooler here, heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Grace crept toward the sitting room, her movements careful and quiet. As she neared the doorway, she heard voices, low, murmuring voices that sent a shiver down her spine. Peering around the corner, she saw them. Victoria stood near the large glass coffee table, her back to Grace. She was dressed in a silk robe that shimmered faintly under the chandelier's light. Beside her stood Brian, his tall frame leaning casually against the arm of the sofa. His hands were in his pockets, and a smirk played on his lips as he listened to Victoria speak. "Timing is everything," Victoria was saying, her tone sharp and businesslike. "If we rush, it'll look suspicious. We need to be careful." Brian shrugged. "It's your call, V. I just think the sooner we handle it, the better. He's a smart guy. He might figure it out." Victoria let out a low laugh, the sound cold and mirthless. "Peter trusts me. He won't suspect a thing." Grace clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Every word felt like a dagger to her chest. They were plotting against Peter, and they didn't even bother to hide their disdain for him. "What about the paperwork?" Brian asked. Victoria waved a hand dismissively. "Already taken care of. Once he's out of the picture, everything will transfer to me automatically. The lawyers won't even question it." Grace felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. How could someone be so cruel, so heartless? Peter wasn't just her employer, He was a kind man, a good man who had given Grace a chance when she had nothing. She wanted to burst into the room and scream at them, to call them out for their lies and betrayal.
But her feet wouldn't move. Her voice wouldn't come. Brian stepped closer to Victoria, his smirk widening. "You're something else, you know that," he said, his voice dripping with admiration. Then he wrapped his hands around her waist, trailing his tongue from her neck to her lips. Victoria tilted her head, a satisfied smile on her lips. "I know." Their laughter echoed through the sitting room, a sound that made Grace's stomach churn. She couldn't listen to any more. She turned and hurried back down the hallway, her footsteps light but frantic. Back in her room, Grace shut the door and leaned against it, her breathing ragged. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything she had just heard. They were planning to take everything from Peter, his wealth, his company, his legacy. But there was something else, something unspoken in their words that chilled her to the bone. "Once he's out of the picture." What did that mean? Were they planning to hurt him? Grace felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She sank to the floor, her head in her hands. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't stand by and watch Peter be destroyed by the very people he trusted most. But what could she do? She was just a maid, a powerless servant in a world of money and power. As the night stretched on, Grace made a silent vow. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to stop them. She would protect Peter, even if it meant risking everything. Because sometimes, even the smallest voices could make the biggest difference. The next morning, Grace stood at the far end of the dining room, her hand steadying a tray as she set the table for breakfast. Victoria sat elegantly at the head of the table, her silk robe replaced with a pristine white dress that hugged her slender frame. She sipped her black coffee delicately, her sharp gaze darting toward the large clock on the wall. Grace noticed how often she glanced at it, as if waiting for something, or someone. "Is the orange juice fresh?" Victoria asked suddenly, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied softly, placing the jug on the table. Victoria didn't respond. Instead, her fingers tapped rhythmically against the tablecloth. Her mood felt restless, tense. Something about her demeanor this morning set Grace on edge. At that moment, the sound of small, rushing footsteps echoed from the hallway. James and Emma, Peter's 8-year-old twins, tumbled into the dining room. Their giggles briefly cut through the tension as they slid into their seats. "Good morning, Mommy," James chirped, reaching for the toast. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, darlings. Eat your breakfast quickly. You'll be late for school." Grace hovered near the door, her gaze shifting between Victoria and the children. Despite everything she knew now, Grace couldn't help but feel an ache in her chest when she looked at James and Emma. How could Victoria plan such a vile betrayal when she had these two innocent children? Once the children were off to school and the house fell quiet again, Victoria rose from the dining table, her movements sharp and decisive. She turned to Grace, who was busy clearing the plates. "I'm heading out," Victoria announced, grabbing her purse from the counter. "Make sure you clean up properly. I don't want to see a speck of dust when I return." "Yes, ma'am," Grace murmured, keeping her eyes on the plates. Victoria paused at the doorway, her gaze lingering on Grace for a beat too long. It wasn't the usual look of superiority or dismissal, it was more calculating, as if she were assessing something. "You've been quiet lately," Victoria said, her tone casual but laced with suspicion. "Anything you want to tell me?" Grace's heart skipped a beat. She shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am." Victoria's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. I like when people know their place." With that, she turned and strode out of the house, the echo of her heels fading into silence. Grace let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the dining table. Victoria's words replayed in her mind like a warning bell. She suspects something. The truth was becoming harder to bear. Every minute that passed, Grace felt like she was walking on thin ice. Victoria's presence, her sharp eyes, her calculated movements, it all loomed over her like a shadow. And yet, Grace couldn't let fear stop her. She knew she had to find a way to save Peter. The question was how. The air inside the Cole mansion was thick with tension, though no one else seemed to notice it except Grace. She stood near the dining area, hands clasped tightly before her, as Victoria moved gracefully around the sitting room, her movements deliberate, her expression too composed. Peter Jaga had just returned from his latest business trip overseas. He sat on one of the plush leather chairs, oblivious to the storm brewing under his own roof. He was reviewing some documents, his eyes focused and weary. "Darling," Victoria's smooth voice broke through the quiet, "why don't you relax? You've been working since you got back. Let me pour you something." Peter glanced up, offering her a tired but appreciative smile. "You're right. I could use a drink." Victoria turned to the bar cart, her lips curling faintly into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Grace, watching from the corner of the room, felt her heart rate quicken. She had noticed earlier when Victoria slipped something small and white into the pocket of her silk robe. Now, she saw it again. As Victoria reached for the glass and the bottle of juice, she glanced over her shoulder to ensure Peter wasn't looking. From her pocket, she retrieved a small packet, a fine white powder that disappeared the moment it touched the liquid. Grace's breath hitched. She watched in frozen silence as Victoria stirred the drink gently, the ice clinking against the sides of the glass, masking the quiet sound of the substance dissolving. Her smile grew as she turned back to Peter, holding out the glass. "Here, darling," she said sweetly. "It's fresh. Just the way you like it." Peter took the glass with a nod of thanks, lifting it slightly as he prepared to take a sip. Grace's entire body tensed. She couldn't let this happen, she wouldn't let it happen. A voice in her head screamed warnings, "Don't interfere. You'll be thrown out. She'll ruin you," but her conscience was louder. Her feet moved before she knew what she was doing. Immediately the shrill ring of Victoria's phone cut through the room. Victoria flinched. She grabbed the phone, answering it with a smile. "Yes, done. Few minutes from now," she said into the receiver, stepping aside. Grace swooped low and hid behind the couch. "Sir." Grace's voice cracked the silence, startling Peter. He paused with the glass inches from his lips, looking at her with faint surprise. "Don't drink it, sir," Grace whispered, her lips trembling. "Sir, I saw Madam put something in the juice. Please don't drink it." Peter froze as he watched Grace's confusion. He didn't know what to say. If he should doubt her or what. Grace stretched her hand, took the glass out of Peter's hand. Peter watched her carefully, suspicion blooming across his face. Grace stayed silent, clutching the glass in her shaking hands. When Victoria's conversation dragged on for a moment, Peter looked at Grace and gave a small, subtle nod, an acknowledgement. Understanding passed between them. Grace set the glass down on the table, her shoulders slumping in relief. Victoria ended her call and turned back to the room, a smile on her face. She noticed the empty glass on the table, her expression softened into satisfaction. "Oh," she said casually, her smile tightening. "You finished it already?" Peter leaned back into his chair, his face calm. "Yes," he replied simply. Victoria's smile deepened. "Good. You needed it." Grace swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Peter, whose calm facade didn't waver. For a moment, the room fell into an eerie silence. Then Peter shifted, his face contorting into sudden discomfort. He groaned softly, clutching his stomach. "Ugh." Victoria's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly masked it with feigned concern. "Peter? What's wrong?" Peter groaned again, louder this time. His body slumped forward, and then he toppled out of the chair, sprawling on the floor. "Peter!" Victoria cried, rushing toward him. She dropped to her knees, shaking his shoulder. "Peter, wake up! What's happening?" Grace watched, her heart pounding as Victoria's panic became frantic. She stood frozen, knowing this was all part of Peter's plan. Victoria fumbled for her phone, dialing a number quickly. "Brian," she hissed into the phone. "Come now." "It worked, he's down. Bring the car. We need to pack up the documents before his family arrives." Minutes later, Brian burst into the mansion, his face smug and confident. "Where is he?" Victoria pointed at Peter's still form on the floor. "Help me pack the papers. We don't have much time." Brian nodded and began grabbing stacks of documents and files, stuffing them into a leather bag. Victoria moved quickly, searching through drawers for more valuables and important papers. They were so preoccupied that they didn't see it. Peter's fingers twitched. Then, in one swift motion, he sprang up from the floor, his dark eyes blazing with fury. "Going somewhere?" Victoria screamed, spinning around. Brian froze in place, his mouth hanging open. You are alive?" Victoria stammered, her face draining of all color. Peter stepped forward, his towering figure imposing. "You tried to kill me," he growled. "In my own home." Victoria shook her head wildly. "No. It's not what you think." "Grace told me everything," Peter interrupted coldly, his gaze flicking to the maid who stood quietly by the door. "She saved me." Brian dropped the bag, raising his hands in surrender. "Look, man, I had nothing to do with this." "Save it," Peter snapped. Peter made a call and within minutes, police sirens wailed outside the mansion. Officers stormed in, handcuffing Victoria and Brian as they screamed and protested. Peter turned to Grace, his expression softening. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "Thank you." Grace bowed her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I only did what was right, sir." Victoria's cries still echoed faintly in Peter's mind, though she had been dragged away nearly an hour ago. The police had taken both her and Brian, leaving behind a vacuum, an emptiness that felt as cold as betrayal itself. Peter Jaga sat alone in the sitting room, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands laced together as he stared blankly at the floor. Documents that had once symbolized his empire were strewn across the coffee table, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. The weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on his chest. His wife, the woman he had trusted, the mother of his children, had planned to kill him. The poison still sat untouched in the glass Grace had taken from him. For the first time in years, Peter felt vulnerable, as though the mighty fortress he had built around himself had crumbled into dust. From the doorway, Grace stood quietly, watching him. She clutched her hands together, uncertain if she should speak. The sight of the man who had always seemed so invincible, now sitting in silence and despair, broke her heart. She wanted to say something, anything, but words failed her. After what felt like an eternity, Peter finally spoke. "Grace." His voice was low, heavy with emotion. He didn't look up, but his tone carried enough authority to make Grace step cautiously into the room. "Sir," she muttered, barely audible. Peter lifted his head then, his dark eyes meeting hers. The usual sharpness in them was dulled, replaced by something raw and deeply human. "You knew, didn't you?" Grace's breath hitched. She lowered her gaze, guilt flooding her chest. I suspected," she admitted softly. "But I didn't have the right to speak, sir. Madam warned me that if I said anything," she trailed off, her voice breaking. Peter let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. She silenced you with threats. He exhaled deeply, leaning back in the chair, his gaze shifting to the ceiling as though searching for answers. I was blind, Grace. Completely blind. The woman I loved, his voice caught for a moment before he pushed on. She would have killed me for money. And I never saw it coming. Grace's heart ached as she listened to him. She could only imagine the weight of the betrayal he felt, but it wasn't her place to comfort him. She remained quiet, waiting for his words. You saved my life, Peter said finally, his voice softer now. If you hadn't spoken up, I wouldn't be here right now. Grace shook her head quickly. I only did what anyone would have done, sir. No, Peter said firmly, sitting up straighter. Not everyone would have risked their place, risked their safety, for me. He studied her for a long moment, as though seeing her properly for the first time. Her simple dress, her calloused hands, her gentle eyes, she was nothing like Victoria. She was honest. Selfless. Pure. The silence stretched again before Peter stood, his tall figure looming over her. Grace instinctively took a step back, still unused to being this close to her employer. I owe you my life, Grace, Peter said, his tone steady now. And I repay my debts. Grace's eyes widened, fear flickering across her face. No, sir. You owe me nothing, she said quickly. Please don't think of it that way. I wasn't expecting anything. I just couldn't let it happen. Peter smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in it. We'll see, he replied cryptically. He glanced toward the hallway, where the distant sound of his children's voices echoed faintly from upstairs. My children will need me now more than ever, he murmured, almost to himself. They'll have questions. Questions I don't yet know how to answer. Grace swallowed hard, unsure what to say. She watched as Peter straightened his shoulders, the cracks in his composure slowly disappearing as the powerful man returned to himself. Go get some rest, Grace, Peter said quietly, his gaze softening as he looked at her. You've done enough for tonight. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, whispering, Good night, sir. With that, she turned and left the room, the faint shuffle of her footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The next morning, the world woke up to the scandal of the century. Newspapers splashed Victoria's face across their front pages, headlines screaming of betrayal, attempted murder, and greed. Words like oil magnate's wife caught in murder plot and the poisoned marriage dominated newsstands. Peters's phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from business associates, family members, and journalists all demanding answers. He ignored them all. Inside the mansion, Peter remained focused on his children. 8-year-old James and Emma were too young to fully understand what had happened, but their absence at breakfast, no cheerful laughter, no demands for toys or stories, was another ache in Peter's chest. He found them sitting in their room, both curled up on the floor. Daddy? James whispered when Peter entered. He knelt beside him, pulling both children into his arms. I'm here, he said softly, kissing their foreheads. Everything will be okay. I promise. James looked up, his voice trembling. Where's Mommy? Peter closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Mommy had to go away for a while, he said carefully. But I'm here now. And I won't let anything happen to you. James nodded slowly, leaning against his father, while Emma buried his face in Peter's chest. From outside the doorway, Grace watched silently, her own heart heavy. She had never seen this side of Peter before, a man broken, yet fiercely protective of his children. Meanwhile, in the dingy holding cell of a city police station, Victoria sat on the cold bench, her head in her hands. She had been interrogated all night, forced to relive every detail of her plan, and every step of her downfall. Brian, who sat in the adjoining cell, refused to look at her. When she had demanded answers earlier, his response had shattered what little remained of her dignity. "I never loved you," he'd said with a smirk. "You were just a shortcut to the good life." And now, as she sat in her filthy cell, Victoria realized the truth: Brian was already married. His wife had known about their affair the entire time, quietly waiting for karma to take its course. Her betrayal, her lies, and her greed had led her to this moment. Peter's mansion, his fortune, his loyalty, it was all gone. Brian had used her. And now she had nothing. Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she mumbled, "What have I done?" Peter sat at the breakfast table, his children on either side. The clinking of utensils on plates was the only sound as Grace moved quietly around the dining room, placing fresh toast and juice before the family. Her presence, though unassuming, carried a calming effect. "Daddy, will Mommy come back?" Emma asked suddenly, her small voice cutting through the silence. Peter paused mid-sip, his eyes meeting Grace's briefly before turning to his daughter. He forced a calm smile. "Emma, Mommy needs to take some time away," he said softly. "But you don't have to worry. Daddy's here, and we're going to be just fine." Emma nodded slowly, not fully understanding but trusting his words. James, who had been quietly observing, pushed his plate away and looked at his father. "Are you okay, Dad?" Peter felt his heart tighten. The child's concern struck him more deeply than he expected. "I'm fine, James," he said, ruffling his son's hair. "We'll get through this together, all right?" James nodded, a faint smile crossing his face as if he knew what his father meant. From the side of the room, Grace watched the scene unfold, her heart aching for them. She couldn't imagine what Peter was going through, what the children were trying to process. As a maid, she had always been on the sidelines, unseen and unnoticed. But now, everything has changed. Peter glanced toward her, breaking her thoughts. "Grace," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Sit. Have breakfast with us." Grace froze, her eyes widening in surprise. "Sir?" "No, I couldn't. I insist." Peter's voice was calm but firm. He gestured to the chair nearest the table. "You've been on your feet all morning. Sit." Grace hesitated, glancing at the children, who were already watching her with curious eyes. She wiped her hands nervously on her apron before lowering herself into the chair. Her movements were hesitant, unsure. Peter poured her a glass of juice and slid it toward her. "You saved my life, Grace. You saved this family. The least I can do is make you feel like you're part of it." Grace's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her lap, not knowing what to say. For someone who had always been told to stay in her place, this kindness felt unfamiliar, both sweet and overwhelming. Days turned into weeks, and life in the Jaga mansion settled into a quiet routine. The media frenzy surrounding Victoria's betrayal slowly died down, though her face still occasionally appeared in headlines. Peter threw himself into his work, determined to restore normalcy to his children's lives. His focus sharpened, his confidence unshaken, yet there were nights when the loneliness crept in, when the weight of betrayal settled heavily on his shoulders. Victoria, on the other hand, was drowning in the consequences of her actions. Locked behind bars as her case awaited trial, she spent her days in cold silence. Brian had been released on bail, but he hadn't bothered to check on her. He'd moved on quickly, leaving Victoria to rot in her shame. One morning, Victoria was allowed a visitor. She sat in the cold interrogation room, her handcuffed wrists resting on the metal table as the door opened. Her heart leapt faintly when she saw Peter walk in, dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. "Peter," she mumbled slowly, rising slightly. "Sit down," Peter said coldly, his voice sharp enough to slice through the tension. Victoria sank back into her chair, her once beautiful face now pale and gaunt. "I just wanted to explain." "There's nothing left to explain, Victoria," Peter interrupted, his tone void of emotion. "You made your choices. I trusted you with everything, my heart, my children, my home, and you tried to take my life in return. I gave you everything, but it wasn't enough for you. You wanted more, and now you have seen where your greediness landed you." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes as she reached out, her cuffed hands trembling. "I made a mistake, Peter. I was stupid, No." Peter's voice rose slightly, his anger finally surfacing. "You weren't just stupid. You were cruel. You planned to murder me for money. You lied to me, you betrayed our family, and for what? A man who was never yours to begin with." Victoria's sobs broke the silence. "I've lost everything. You, the children. You don't get to claim them anymore," Peter shot back, standing tall. "They deserve better than a mother who would destroy their father." He turned to leave, pausing only to add, "I hope you reflect on what you've done, Victoria. Because this is your doing. This is where your greed and betrayal have led you." With that, Peter walked out, leaving Victoria sobbing into her hands, regret consuming her entirely. Back at the mansion, Grace continued her duties, though her relationship with Peter had shifted. He treated her with a respect and kindness that no employer had ever shown her before. One evening, Peter found Grace sweeping the garden patio. "Grace," he called, walking toward her. She straightened immediately, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sir?" Peter hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "How long have you been with us?" "6 months, sir." "And in that time," Peter said slowly, "you've shown more honesty, more courage, than anyone else in my life." Grace blinked, not sure where this was going. I don't understand." Peter stepped closer, his gaze soft but unwavering. "Grace, you saved me. You saved my children. You gave me a second chance at life." Grace shook her head quickly. "I didn't do it for reward, sir." "I know," Peter said gently. "That's why it means so much." He took a deep breath before speaking again. "I don't want you to just be the maid anymore. You deserve more. You deserve to be happy." Grace. Grace's heart thundered in her chest as she looked at him, her lips trembling. "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying," Peter's voice softened, "that I don't want to face this new chapter of my life alone. I want you by my side. Not as a maid, but as my wife." The broom fell from Grace's hands, clattering to the ground. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at Peter, her mind spinning. "Me? But sir." "Peter," he corrected softly. "No more, sir. Just Peter." Grace pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "Why me?" "Because you've shown me what real love and loyalty look like," Peter said simply. "And I think you're the only one who can help me build a better future, for me and my children." Grace let out a choked sob, her heart overflowing with emotions she couldn't put into words. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll stand by you, Peter." Peter smiled warmly, reaching for her hand and holding it gently in his. For the first time in a long time, the future felt hopeful again. The days following Peter's heartfelt proposal to Grace were a whirlwind of emotions for her. She was no longer simply the maid in the Jaga mansion. The staff had been quietly informed of the changes, though whispers still floated through the corridors. Grace, now free of her faded uniform, carried herself with hesitant pride. The mansion seemed brighter, filled with the laughter of children and the quiet hum of a family healing. Peter was a changed man, more attentive to James and Emma, and more present. He often stole glances at Grace, his gratitude for her unwavering loyalty and strength growing deeper by the day. Peter's decision to marry Grace was not without its storms. The news made its way beyond the mansion walls, stirring both admiration and judgment from society. Business associates, relatives, and even the media had questions. How could a man of Peter Jaga's status fall in love with a simple village girl? A maid. One morning, as Grace stood in the vast kitchen arranging fruit for the children's breakfast, Peter's sister, Mary, arrived unannounced. She was a tall, elegant woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. Her heels clicked ominously on the marble floors as she entered the kitchen. "Good morning, Ma," Grace greeted politely, setting down the tray. "Welcome, Ma." Mary ignored the greetings, narrowing her gaze at the woman before her. "So it's true." Grace paused, her hands instinctively fidgeting at the cold tone. "What?" "You," Mary said, her voice dripping with disdain, "the maid, marrying my brother. Do you know what people are saying? That you planned all of this. That you wormed your way into his heart because you wanted his money." Grace flinched as though struck. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Before Mary could continue, Peter's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Mary." Mary turned abruptly to see her brother leaning against the kitchen door frame, his expression hard and unyielding. "Peter," she began, "I'm only trying to look out for you." "By insulting the woman who saved my life?" Peter interrupted coolly, walking toward Grace and standing beside her. "Grace has done nothing but prove her loyalty to this family. She's the reason I'm standing here today." Mary folded her arms, glaring at Grace as if she were a nuisance. "Do you even know what you're doing? She doesn't belong in your world." "I decide who belongs in my world," Peter said firmly, his eyes steady. "And Grace does." Mary's lips tightened. "This is a mistake, Peter. Marrying her will ruin your reputation." "Then let it be ruined," Peter said sharply. "The dead don't have reputation. I would have been dead if not for her sake. I would rather be judged for marrying a woman of integrity than live with someone like Victoria." Mary scoffed in disbelief but knew better than to argue further. She shot one last cold glance at Grace before turning on her heel and storming out. Once she was gone, Peter turned to Grace, his face softening. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." Grace lowered her gaze, trying to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. "Maybe she's right, Peter. Maybe I don't belong in this life. I'm just a village girl." Peter tilted her chin up gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Don't ever say that. You belong here because I choose you. Not for who you were, but for who you are. Your heart, Grace, that's what matters." Grace nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through the doubt clouding her face. Days later, Peter officially announced his engagement to Grace. The media erupted in a frenzy. Articles speculated about the maid-turned-fiancé, gossip columns compared Grace to Victoria, and headlines splashed words like "Cinderella story" and "shocking twist." But Peter remained unfazed. To him, the opinions of others were insignificant. He knew his truth, and so did Grace. Emma and James, on the other hand, were overjoyed. They had grown attached to Grace, seeing her as the quiet anchor in their turbulent lives. Emma insisted on calling her Mommy Grace even before the wedding, and James, though more reserved, showed his affection through small gestures, like helping her carry groceries or choosing her flowers from the garden. The mansion had never looked more beautiful. White roses draped the banisters, delicate ribbons adorned the chairs, and a soft melody floated through the grand hall. Peter stood tall at the altar, dressed in a sharp black suit, his gaze fixed on the doorway where Grace would appear. His heart beat with anticipation. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the beginning of a second chance at happiness. When Grace finally stepped through the doors, every head turned. She wore a simple but elegant white gown that hugged her figure, the delicate lace brushing the floor. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her face glowed with a quiet beauty. Peter couldn't take his eyes off her. In that moment, nothing else mattered, no judgments, no whispers, only her. Grace reached the altar, her hands trembling slightly as Peter took them into his own. You look beautiful, he whispered softly. Tears shimmered in Grace's eyes as she smiled. Thank you, for everything. The ceremony was intimate and heartfelt. As they exchanged vows, Peter's voice was steady and filled with sincerity. Grace, you gave me my life back. You saved my children, my home, and my heart. I promise to love you, protect you, and honor you for as long as I live. Grace's voice trembled as she replied. Peter, you gave me hope when I had nothing. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I promise to stand by you and love you, no matter what life brings our way. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and as Peter leaned in to kiss her, the room erupted in applause. Emma clapped excitedly, and even James cracked a rare, wide smile. For the first time in a long time, laughter echoed through the Jaga estate, not forced, not masked, but genuine and full of life. Meanwhile, miles away in the small, stark prison cell where Victoria sat, the news of Peter's marriage reached her. A tabloid magazine lay crumpled in her hands, Grace's radiant image splashed across the cover beside Peter. Victoria's heart twisted painfully. The man she had once shared a life with had moved on, finding happiness with someone else. Brian, the man she destroyed her marriage for, had vanished completely. Her foolishness and greed had cost her everything, her family, her children, and her freedom. Tears spilled onto the magazine as regret consumed her. It should have been me, she thought bitterly. But she knew, deep down, that she had no one to blame but herself. The days after the wedding brought peace that Peter and Grace had both long yearned for. The mansion no longer echoed with hollow silence, it was now filled with laughter, love, and a sense of belonging. Grace, though still adjusting to her new life, embraced her role as a mother to James and Emma and a partner to Peter. Peter worked hard to ensure Grace felt comfortable in her new world. He shielded her from unnecessary attention and never allowed her to feel like an outsider among his circle. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Grace's gentle nature and unwavering loyalty were the cornerstones of their new life together, while Peter's determination to cherish her became his greatest promise. One morning, as Grace sat on the garden bench watching Emma and James play, a familiar voice startled her. "You look comfortable here," said Mary, Peter's sister, who had once voiced her doubts. Her tone was less cold now, though her expression remained guarded. Grace turned calmly, offering her a polite smile. "I am. This place feels like home now." Mary studied her, as if trying to decipher the secret to Grace's strength. "You've surprised me," she admitted. "Most women would have turned this into a story of revenge or greed. But you just want to love them, don't you?" Grace's gaze softened as she looked at the children, then back at Mary. "I never wanted anything more. I didn't ask for this life. It found me." For a moment, Mary said nothing. Finally, she gave a small nod, her expression thawing. "Peter was right about you. Perhaps you do belong here after all." With that, she walked away, leaving Grace with a small sense of victory, not for herself, but for the life she was building. As Grace and Peter began their life anew, the shadows of the past finally caught up with Brian. Brian's wife, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diana, had always known about his infidelity but remained quiet, for her children, for her pride. When news of Victoria's imprisonment spread, Diana took action. She exposed Brian's shady business dealings, his debts, and his secrets to the world. Bank accounts were frozen. His assets were seized. Brian, once so confident in his ability to manipulate people, now found himself cornered, penniless, and alone. Word of Brian's downfall reached Victoria in prison. She stared blankly at the cracked walls of her cell as the news sank in. The man she had betrayed her husband for, the man for whom she had lost everything, was nothing but a hollow lie. In that moment, Victoria finally accepted the bitter truth. She had traded gold for dust. Months passed. Peter's life with Grace flourished as their bond deepened and the children thrived. The mansion was a place of warmth again, filled with shared meals, family outings, and quiet evenings on the balcony. One evening, as Peter prepared for a family trip, he received a letter. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. It was from Victoria. Peter read the letter in silence. In it, Victoria pleaded for forgiveness. She spoke of her regret, her ruined life, and the consequences of her choices. She begged to see James and Emma, even if just once. Peter set the letter down, his expression unreadable. Grace, who had noticed his quiet demeanor, approached him gently. "Is everything okay?" Peter handed her the letter. Grace read it carefully, her brow furrowing. "Will you go?" she asked softly. Peter sighed deeply. "No," he said after a long pause. "Victoria made her choices. She hurt our family and betrayed every ounce of trust. I won't allow her near the children again, not while they're finally happy." Grace nodded in agreement, though her heart ached for Victoria. She could imagine the loneliness that came from realizing one's own mistakes too late. As time passed, Grace and Peter's family blossomed. James and Emma grew closer to Grace, seeing her not as someone who replaced their mother, but as a source of love and comfort. One afternoon, as Peter returned from work, he found Grace seated on the balcony, the setting sun casting a warm glow over her face. James and Emma were curled up beside her, listening to her gentle voice as she read them a story. Peter paused to take it all in, the laughter of his children, the peace in Grace's eyes, and the life they had rebuilt together. He walked over and kissed Grace softly on the forehead. "Thank you," he muttered. "For what?" she asked, smiling up at him. "For saving me," Peter said, his voice full of emotion. "For saving all of us." Grace leaned into him, her heart full. She never imagined a life like this, a life where love, loyalty, and forgiveness could transform pain into something beautiful.